regular contributor to the show from LifeNet in New Zealand, Brendan Malone. Brendan, kia ora, thank you for your time today.
Oh, great to be here as always, Andrew.
Now, representing the laity again, as it were, but again, this is very Pope Francis, his spirit of inclusion, saying, look, this isn't just for the bishops and cardinals to decide in terms of who we are as a church. Bringing members of the laity into the conversation, the discussion, and even the decision-making. I mean, it didn't go down well with everybody, though, this synodal process, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of probably the three key defining hallmarks of this papacy, I guess you might call them the three great promises. And it's one of them, I think, that I'm not sure it will actually last beyond his papacy, actually. Yep. I think the idea, I think, was there was something good about the idea at the heart of it, but it once you got up to the international level, it became a bit unwieldy, and I'm not sure it actually quite managed to work. Like, it's one thing to have at the local level people in conversation and discussion, but once you amplify that up to the international level, it's really hard to actually say you are now hearing from the voices of everyone when it's only a small committee meeting in one place. So I think the idea. You've got to say there's a beautiful sort of gesture and a desire there for something good. I think implementation wise, I'm not sure it actually did manage to deliver, and I don't know if it will. It'll be interesting to see, of course, who comes next, but I suspect it might actually pass.
Democracy is a great idea in theory, actually, but I think it's Winston Churchill that says it's the worst form of government apart from all of the others. And when we look at it on an international scale, United Nations, anyone? I mean,
and it's hard to govern the church in that way. The church is a call to be faithful to Christ rather than just to say, well, let's have a vote and see what everyone wants to do. So, it's a bit tricky.
In some ways, and as you say, this is one of the legacy pillars, I suppose, pushing back against the idea that the Catholic Church was too hierarchical, too top-down, that there was there was not enough accountability for what was happening in the hallowed halls, as it were. Certainly swimming against the tide, a different direction, even if it doesn't stick.
Well, it's interesting because I think this was very much, in a sense, this idea was actually pretty much a secular media creation.
Yep.
Because if you actually look, for example, Pope Benedict, when he was Pope, he was very bold on the same point. He actually said at one point, the Pope does not rule like an absolute monarch. That is not the Catholic teaching, and he must not be seen that way. Mm-hmm. So I think perhaps the idea that Francis was doing something new here was a little bit, I think, was a bit of the part of the mystique, if you like.
Yes.
Ironically, though, in some areas, though, the papacy actually became a lot more autocratic and a lot more top-down. Mm-hmm. For example, if you're a traditional Catholic, there were restrictions placed from the top down and sort of, so it's a mixed bag. In some cases it was, okay, let's hear from everybody. In other cases it was, right, no, we'll actually call the tune here and you will do what we say. So it was it's an interesting thing. I guess it's the challenge of being the chief shepherd of such a massive group of Christians.
And you make a great point, actually, because the media misinterpretation of what it means to be a Catholic, and certainly the hierarchy. I mean, even with, of course, recent movies like Conclave, of course, people now think they know what's about to happen at St. Peter's. Or, thinking back to the two popes, fictional story based on historical events loosely, or even Dan Brown at his worst. People have this idea of this is what the Catholic Church is like, in actual fact very different than the way Hollywood depicts it.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say too, there's two tiers here. There's always been an issue, and again, this is the nature of how even Christian institutions and even the church itself, once you get so big and you get into governance issues, you can have that political creep that comes in. Yep. And it was clear, I think, even in the final weeks of the Pope's life, that there was what you might call a bit of Vatican intrigue going on. The health updates were kind of vague, but I was constantly communicating with a good friend who was a nurse, and her and I were both in agreement. This was a lot more serious than what was being let on. Yep. And that actually did turn out to be the case. And you could sort of see that intrigue, I'm sure right now there will be people at the highest levels in Rome having conversations about, who do you think should be the next Pope? And so it's just the reality of it, unfortunately. It's I think as someone once described it as one of the most holy institutions that's run with the most knavish imbecility at the same time. It's a sort of a very odd thing, and it's a proof of the Holy Spirit at work in a sense, because he puts up with all of that. So
exactly. Wanting to talk about the legacy of Pope Francis and some of the things that might stick. Some of the things that might be part of the Catholic Church going forward, and the way in which the Catholic Church is, in some ways, forever changed because of Pope Francis's legacy. What do you think's on that list, Brendan?
Well, it's an interesting question, actually. I've been reflecting on that last couple of days, Andrew, and I want to be a little bit contrarian in a sense and say that I think that legacy is a hard thing to define this early on. One thing I've really learnt over the recent years by reading a lot more history is that what you can think in the immediate aftermath of someone's passing or a major event, you think that's going to be the legacy, but in actual fact, it takes decades to really reveal what the legacy really will be. So it's hard to know. I know some people are saying, oh, this is the most consequential papacy we've ever had. I don't think that's true, actually. Okay. I really don't. If you look at the broad history of the church, there's been plenty of big moments. I think there will be some interesting things as we move forward. I suspect that there's going to be conversations that maybe weren't intended. Like there may well be a conversation within the church over the coming decades about, well, what do the limits of, for example, papal authority look like and things like this? These are things we've never had to grapple with, but now we've had a pope who is very heard from, like a lot, media interviews, social media has changed the game. You go back 200 years, Andrew, and the majority of Catholics, overwhelming majority, would have never even have heard the voice of the Pope. These things, and so these new situations create new challenges. I think some of the things he simplified and changed, there will be, in a sense, even some of the funeral rites for the papacy and things, some of these things might be a trajectory that others follow. It's kind of hard to gauge at the moment exactly what that will all mean. And I suspect my grandkids might have a better grasp. If you're still around somehow, then they could probably answer that question better than I can right now.
Now, in terms of what's sticking out, and again, media bias here, I suppose the headlines, the controversy, some of the movements towards inclusion, to welcome people who are divorced or remarried, to be more open to considering people in same-sex relationships, for example. There is a lot of controversy around these complex issues and conversations. I'm sure will continue whoever the next pope is.
Well, and I think it's interesting, again, you get this sort of mainstream media, secular media creation and mystique in a certain mythology, because you're right. On the one hand, you have this moment where he's challenged and he says, well, who am I to judge, in a specific question about seminarians and sexuality. But then at another point, he also refers to same-sex marriage as a machination from the father of lies. Yeah. He was very strong in speaking out against gender ideology, abortion, euthanasia, very strong. So it's an interesting thing. I think what's clear, though, is that he definitely wanted, and you see this often in his actions, there's a desire to try and do everything to remove obstacles for people and open those doors and engage. And but then at other times, as I said, there's like, for example, I have friends. I'm not in the traditional Catholic, Latin mass going Catholic, but they really felt that they were actually pushed to the peripheries in this papacy, and I don't think that's an unreasonable feeling they had because of the treatment they received. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. It's very interesting, but I think ultimately you're right. The great challenge, and I think Francis challenged all of us really, is to are we really going to be people who have a genuine, like he talked about the idea of the church not simply being a museum. He's not the first to say this either, but the idea that it should be a sort of a hospital for those in need, not simply a museum full of historic and beautiful things, but a place that's alive and welcoming. And I think that's always an ever relevant challenge for every Christian.
And I suppose reframing that question asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor, that it is perhaps somebody who has a different theological, political, or even idea of sexuality than us. These people are also our neighbor and deserving of God's love.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think even just the ability to dialogue well, I think that the church, any denomination within Christianity, I think we're at our worst when we allow politics to shape theology and spirituality and morality and our pastoral actions. Instead, those things we should take into the world of politics and say, well, let's try and reshape politics accordingly. And too often it goes the other way. And I think we're at our worst when we sort of almost we get these cringy, awkward political attempts to try and engage on like sexuality issues instead of just saying, hey, we love you, but here's our point of difference.
Yep.
And just being loving, but also truthfully honest. And that's an act of love to tell people the truth as well. And I think that's a really prescient challenge for us. How do we do that well? And I think in Francis, interestingly, you do see that. So there is the willingness to dialogue with people, but then also, as I said, he makes some very bold and unflinching moral statements at the same time. And so you're never left in two minds about where the church stands, in a sense.
To an extent, as we look back over previous papacies, there's a tendency, well, at least an appearance, of a pendulum swing to go from more conservative to liberal and back again. And for each change in the papacy, this tends to happen, well, at least according to some commentators. Is that a part of the process? Should we expect perhaps a more conservative pope this time round? Or what's your thoughts on that, Brendan?
Well, I'm not entirely sure that's correct. Being a student of history and really trying to read a bit more of history, I don't know if you do see actually that swing consistently going back and forward. I think that's a very modern political interpretation, and possibly even just because some of the nature of what the Francis papacy represents seemed like a swing away, that the assumption is that it's always been like that. I think what you see, for example, with Pope Benedict is a really strong continuation of what Pope John Paul II had, and so on and so on. I think with what'll be interesting to see with the next papacy, and look, it's a grain of salt because everyone right now who's telling you they think they know who it's going to be and what's going to go on, they don't. That's just the reality of it.
Yep.
My suspicion is, though, that the conclave could take a little bit longer this time.
Yeah.
Because there are some big rifts, if you like, that have opened up in the church under this papacy. And I suspect there will be caution this time from a lot more cardinals. And there may well be a desire to have a safe pair of hands. Like the church under the Francis papacy has been through a time of like a very stormy sort of time. Mm-hmm. And I suspect some cardinals might say we actually need to just get a bit of stability and try and heal some of these rifts. We do need to, as I said, like, for example, the question of China, the political engagement with China has not worked out well for persecuted Chinese Catholics under this previous papacy.
Yep.
They might be saying, well, we need a sort of safe pair of hands on that. Traditional Catholics, we need a safe pair of hands to bring back a more pastoral and sort of, complete unity there. So it'll be interesting to see. I wouldn't be surprised, as I said, that there is rather than a continuation, we might see a sort of, okay, let's look for someone who will just steady the ship a little bit.
Well, hey, neither you or I get a vote on this. However, we will be talking to somebody who does get a vote on that. Cardinal John Dew is one of 135 cardinals who will be meeting together in Rome, both for the Pope's funeral this Saturday and then the conclave and the prayerful decision-making process to follow. But Brendan, we appreciate the work that you do at LifeNet. Appreciate your perspective today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Andrew, as always.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.